David Gerwin and Jack Zevin were middle school teachers who went on to get their PhDs and teach at NYU. They wrote two books, one called Teaching U.S. History as a Mystery, and the other Teaching World History as a Mystery. And they make the argument that the question introduces that sense of mystery. It's what fires that dopamine in the brain. It gets them interested as they're trying to figure out what's going on, and it pushes the process forward. And Linda Levstick and Keith Barton, who've done a lifetime career's worth of research on teaching history in elementary and middle school, talk about the fact that the question should be the starting off point. We don't want to end with the question. We want to start with the question. And unfortunately, in our discipline, what we tend to do is give the answer, but never give the question. And then we move on to the next set of answers, but the kids don't know what the answers are to. And it just becomes about information, and after a while, they just drowned in it. And so when you look at the literature, you'll see three phrases that come up that kind of speak to this. One is the idea of problematizing history. The other are what they call substantive dilemmas, and then cognitive puzzles. Looking at our discipline in the way that historians do. They want to know why. Historians know that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He's not living in South America with Tupac. He's dead. What drives them crazy and to write ever increasingly large books is why. Why was he assassinated? And the questions that stem from it. And those are the kind of questions that drive student interest. And so there's two articles in a book that I've sort of pulled these from that look at the development of questions, one of which comes from England, and England has been doing this for decades, the other two from the US. But good history lab questions, first off, have to be debatable. What did Roosevelt mean by the great Arsenio of democracy isn't debatable. We all know what he meant, and once we figured it out, we're good to go and we can move on. We also want questions that help kids to understand how things that dead people did accumulated to impact what's going on today. And so if you go back to the Panama Canal, as I mentioned, the Panama Canal, 1903, 1904 onward, is a long time ago. But my students are connecting it to modern foreign policy and the questions that they ask. And so by picking those topics, it can help kids to understand the present. We also want kids to be in that position of constructing their own meaning. And if you go back to the video with my female student earlier, she talked about the fact that she's building meaning and that that's what draws her in. We also look at interest and imagination of students. What gets your students going? And I'll generally say with my students, if somebody dies, it gets them interested. If somebody lies, it gets them interested. It's those nastier aspects of human behavior that tend to draw them in. Can you put a particular aspect of historical thinking up front? Can kids think about cause? Can they think about effect? Can they think about perspective? And then the question represent a reasonable amount of content. You can't dive deeply in a history lab on one standard. And you know why? Because when the end of the year comes, you'll be several standards short. And so you have to look for the questions that enable you to dive deeply and touch multiple standards. When I originally did this, my goal was to do one lab a unit. And then at the end of the year, I looked at my students' results on the exam and compared it to the previous years. And the numbers went up. So the next year, I did the same labs throughout the bad ones, cleaned them up. They took the exam, numbers went up again. And I slowly massaged it so that they were still getting to where they needed to be, and I wasn't cutting my nose off to spite my face. Couple of things to think about in terms of questions. First off, good lab questions are not the ones that we're most used to. They're not research paper topics. They're not History Day style questions, tragedy and triumph in history. And they're not those essential questions that we find in curricular documents, which are really written for adults. They're also not moral judgments of the past. We don't want our students to simply condemn everyone in the past. We want them to understand why they did what they did and why it occurred in the time period that it occurred. And the example that I always give, I see this a lot in classrooms, should the United States have dropped the atomic bomb? Immediately it's set up to condemn. It's also using sources after the fact. We're reading John Hershey, we're looking at images of Hiroshima. Historians ask, why did the United States use the bomb on Japan? Now we're looking at the decision-making that's leading up to it. We're understanding that decision through the lens of the time period. And so you have to be careful to make sure that you're not setting your kids up to kind of wag their finger at everybody in the past. What I want to do is lay out 4 types of questions, and then I'm going to put you in the position of coming up with a question to guide an historical investigation. The first type of question that I recommend for history labs are what I call options questions. And this is where you give kids some basic parameters with which to wrestle with historic figures. The example that I give is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey always showed up on my end-of-year exam, and I wanted students to be able to dive deeply into race relations in the 1920s. So the question that we posed for students was, Marcus Garvey, was he a racial visionary or an enemy of the state? And that gave the students a place to start to wrestle with Marcus Garvey. But the key here is we're not asking kids to pick one or the other. It's not an either or. It's not an A answer, B answer, or C answer. It's to force them to think critically. And so my students would wade through 6 documents about Marcus Garvey. They'd have one from W.E.B. Du Bois saying that he's either a lunatic or insane. They have a letter from African-American pastors writing the Justice Department asking for Marcus Garvey to be arrested after meeting with the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta. They have 2 documents from his followers talking about the power of his message and his mission. And they have a document from Marcus Garvey. And what my students do is they begin to see Garvey as nuanced. Well, I think he started as a visionary, but he ended up as an enemy of the state. Or for white people, he was seen as an enemy of the state, but no, a lot of African Americans saw him as an enemy of the state. And it forces them to think about human beings as nuanced. We're never just one thing. And as the year goes along, my kids will start to offer the choices or offer up words to play with them, and it engages them in looking at what's taking place. Another type are what I call source-specific questions. And this is akin to what you did with the Panama Canal. I gave you that excerpt from President Roosevelt's autobiography, and that excerpt becomes the launching off point for the investigation. Oral histories, memoirs, political cartoons, government documents, old history textbooks, all of those can become a stepping off point for a history lab. The image that some of you might be able to see that's here is what we use to start off a lab that looks at the settlement of the West after the American Civil War. And the students look at it, and Southwest Kansas has temperate climate, excellent health, pure and abundant water, good soil for wheat, corn, and fruit. Sun shines out there. And we just pose the question, is this accurate? Is this an accurate depiction of the settlement of the West after the Civil War? And then the kids wade into their sources, and what they realize is that the answer is yes, no, and depends. It depends if you bought your land from the railroad or if you took homesteader land, if you took it during the drought of the 1870s or came in during the wet period of the 1880s, and it depends upon if you are west of the 100th meridian or east of the 100th meridian. And so it becomes that place for complicating the story and getting them to see the difficulties in understanding the past. The third type of question is what I call contextual or empathetic questions. This is where you ask kids to wrestle with events or people as they were wrestled with during the time period. So you want them to put what I call their history goggles on and to see people through the lenses of the time period. An example would be, was President Abraham Lincoln a tyrant? That was the exact language in question that was debated in the Civil War. Keep in mind, I'm from a state where Abraham Lincoln arrested the entire Democratic Party of Baltimore, put them in Fort McHenry, and then turned the guns on the city to make sure nobody tried to break them out. Maryland's story is of Abraham Lincoln as a tyrant. And so kids get to wrestle with that. They have to look at different perspectives. Were the Espionage and Sedition Acts of World War I constitutional? And kids wade into the issues of World War I in terms of dissent and First Amendment protections. And what you want kids to be able to do is see it through the lens of the time period. And then lastly are what I call historiographical questions. Kids think that historians figure out what happened in the past, they write it down, and then it never changes. And all we do is kind of hand the stories down from generation to generation. The first time they realize that we change our telling of the past multiple times, they're really flummoxed. Well, what do you mean? The first time I do it is Reconstruction. And so students read an interpretation of Reconstruction from the 1890s that describes Reconstruction as a failure, and the historians say it failed because African Americans couldn't handle the freedom that was given to them. Then they read an interpretation from the 1920s that say Reconstruction was a failure, but it was due to white political corruption that led to its failure. Then they read one from the 1960s that say it was simply an unfinished revolution that northern whites didn't allow to happen. And then they read one from the 1990s, and Reconstruction was a Southern insurrection to fight the Civil War Part 2 and to win off the battlefield in a different way. Blows kids' minds, and of course their question is, well, what was Reconstruction? That's what we're going to figure out. And so historiographical questions is a way to draw them in as well.